Before you turn it over to those innocent-looking witnesses you have on this subject, would you be good enough, or would they be good enough to introduce themselves?
Yeah,
Just
I'm
may or may not
happy to do that.
Dan, could I just make
Sure,
put a bit of a finer point on the public comment here.
Mm-hmm.
Dan referred to testimony that we're going to take, but I just want to reiterate that the EIR process and the Administrative Procedures Act process for the rulemaking process have official comment periods associated with each, and that's set out in the law. The official comment periods have closed on the EIR process and on the APA process. We may reopen the APA process for an additional 15 days if you decide to go with some of the recommendations or you have other recommendations of your own. But at the present time, the official comment periods have closed, and that means during the official comment periods, when commenters write in, we are obligated to respond to those comments as laid out in the law. And under the CEQA process, we have to respond to the comments formally in what's called a final EIR. Our panel will talk about that in a second. Under the APA process, similarly, we have to respond formally to each of the comments in what's called a final statement of reasons. At this hearing, what we're going to be doing is taking public comment like we take public comment at any regular board meeting. And you'll see that we don't have a court reporter transcribing anything here. So this is a normal opportunity for the public to comment as they would on any agenda item that you take under consideration. The official comment period, again, just to reiterate, has closed on each of these processes, which means that we're not under any legal obligation to formally respond to any of these comments in writing in either the final EIR or in the final statement of reasons under the APA. So with that, I will turn it back to Dan to introduce the panel.
Okay.
Yeah, I do have with me Jim Andrew from the Department of Justice and Ellen Garber, an attorney with Schut, Mahali, and Weinberger, our outside counsel for our secret program here. And we're going to open up with Jim talking about the EIR and the function it serves in the plan process.
Mr. Andrew?
Yes, council members. It's been a while since we've been here, so I wanted to make sure you didn't forget about us and forget about the EIR process. All kidding aside, it has been a long time, and the main reason why we're here today is to give you an update because in May, as others have mentioned, you're going to be asked to certify the final EIR, and we'll talk more later about what that actually means. But there's going to be a lot of paper, as you can imagine, and so we wanted to give you a bit of a preview, an update today, so that the process in May for certifying that final EIR will be a little less daunting. To give you an update today, allow you to ask a few questions, give you a bit of a preview, and to the extent you want to take some time over the next month to look at some of the documents, it'll seem like less of a data dump, so to speak, in May.
I just want to make sure the environmental impact report that was first circulated for public comment, that was in August of 2011?
November of 2011.
No, November of 2011. And I don't know, are those the documents that are wading down the end of each table?
No.
We have a set over on the staff table.
Okay. Ms. Messer, who pumps iron in the morning, is lifting the environmental impact report. Then there was a supplemental volume in the environmental impact report that came out, recirculated draft environmental impact. So that supplemental volume, Ms. Messer, if you would lift that one up too, which I assume is back there somewhere. The supplemental volume was done when?
November of 2012.
That was for public comment?
Yes.
Okay, got it.
So just a little preview of what we're going to talk about today on the EIR process, a little roadmap. First, I'll talk a little bit about just a reminder of what the CEQA process is about, why we have it, why it was done in this case, what its purpose is. Then I'll give a little bit of a background that the chair actually just sort of covered, but I'll provide a little more detail on the process that we've been through to date in the EIR. Then Dan Ray will talk a little bit about the project objectives, the objectives of the Delta Plan, why you have been here for the past 2.5 years, and then how the final staff draft Delta Plan and the project objectives, the alternative Delta Plans, do or do not meet those project objectives. Dan will cover that. Then I'll talk a little bit about what we have learned from the EIR so far and the process so far up to this point. And then Ellen will talk a little bit more detail about the more common themes of the public comment that we received on the EIRs during their circulation period. And then we'll go back to Dan for next steps and what you can expect in May. So a review of the CEQA process and the CEQA requirement. And this is very high level, but I think it's, you can get down in the weeds and sort of forget what the fundamental purpose of CEQA is. Over the past, what are we going on now, 35, almost 40 years of CEQA, it's gotten more and more complicated, but its core requirements are still very important and remain the same, and I think it's helpful just to remember what those are. So the way the CEQA process works is it allows a government agency, when it's doing its own project, to actually develop and design the project that it wants in the first instance, as a matter of policy, as a matter of requirements, as a matter of space needs if you're doing a new city hall or a Delta Plan based on the statute that's been given to you, the Delta Reform Act, and the situation in the Delta. It allows you to design the project you want in the first instance as a policy matter. But then, before you actually commit to that project, CEQA requires that you evaluate the potential environmental consequences of doing what you would otherwise want to do. And the purpose of that evaluation is twofold, and they're both very important. One of them is an informed decision-making element, and it's really an eyes-wide-open statute, so that before a government agency commits to a particular course of action, the decision-makers know what the potential environmental consequences are of doing so. So that's point number one, is informed decision-making. The second part is that CEQA actually requires project modifications through mitigation measures if the mitigation measures are feasible, or adoption of an alternative project if that alternative is feasible, if it has an environmental advantage over the project you otherwise would want, and if it satisfies project objectives. So again, it's twofold. One is informed decision-making, and two is modifying the project through doing it in a way that is less environmentally damaging if you can still meet your core objectives. And that evaluation, as we've discussed, happens via a public process, and it's both very important for the public to know the potential consequences, but also the public comment helps inform the analysis and inform the process and inform the decision-making. And in this case, as we'll talk about here in the next 10 or 15 minutes, it has been helpful. So that's a high-level reminder of what the CEQA process is all about. So the Delta Plan EIR process to date. So the Delta Plan is a very high-level document, obviously. They're not proposing to do any physical actions. There's no projects that you're actually going to go out and contract to have constructed. It's a high-level plan. But there was a fair argument that the Delta Plan implementation, meaning projects that other agencies may do to implement the Delta Plan, there was a fair argument that that implementation may have had a significant adverse impact on the environment, so an EIR was required, and so that's what we did. Under CEQA, EIR was required, so we, the council staff, we prepared one. And this is called a program EIR, and there's generally two types of EIRs. There's a program EIR, and there's a project EIR. And because the Delta Plan is so high level, and it really is a program, we prepare what's called a program EIR. And the law is really clear on this. It says that the degree of specificity required in an EIR will correspond to the degree of specificity involved in the underlying activity. So because the Delta Plan is very high level, the Delta Plan EIR is similarly high level, which is why we did what's called a program EIR. And what that means is when individual agencies come through with covered actions, or they do projects that are not covered actions that are somehow part of the recommendation from the Delta Plan, maybe something in far southern California that doesn't have a connection to the Delta, but is still something that the Delta Plan talked about, those will be done via project-level environmental documents, some cases a project-level EIR, that'll get down into the weeds of exactly where is a project going to be sited, what its footprint's going to be, real precise details, and that'll happen at the project environmental level. So that's just kind of a background as to distinguish between what you've done here, a very high-level document, and that's not the end of the story because you're not providing environmental clearance for construction of anything physical. That'll happen by other agencies. So an EIR process involves generally two steps. It involves a draft EIR, which we've done 2 of, as the chair mentioned, circulation of that draft EIR for public comment. Then you take the written public comment, you do formal written responses to those public comments. You incorporate those responses into what's called a final EIR, that's step 2, and then that whole package is what goes to the decision-making body, which will come to you in May for consideration for certification, and Dan Ray will talk about what that actually means towards the end. So as the chair mentioned, we've done 2. We did a draft EIR in November of 2011 that looked at the 5th staff draft Delta plan. That was a 2-volume EIR. That circulated for a 90-day comment period. There was only 45 days is required under the law, but the council directed that 90 days, a 90-day comment period be done. Then in 2012, as you know, you revised the Delta plan a couple of times, culminating in the final staff draft Delta plan, I think directed in August of last year, finalized and released in November. We did an additional recirculated volume to cover the potential environmental impacts of that final staff draft Delta plan. That circulated for 45 days between November and January. And all of these documents, all these EIR documents, have been on the council website from the moment that they were created and released, and they're still there. So they've been available for public review the whole time. They're still up to date. And I would just reiterate for the public and for the council that the executive summaries to both of the EIR volume 1 of reviewing the from 2011 and volume 3, the executive summaries are very comprehensive. While they're
I brought my recirculated draft executive summary, which at least I can lift coming over here, and it is indeed a pretty good summary, I think.
And it includes all the list of all the impacts and all the mitigation measures. So again, I just highlight that for the council that is a more digestible summary as it is, but it's a comprehensive one, although still digestible. So currently, staff is, as Mr. Stevens mentioned, is preparing written responses to all the public comments that were received on both circulation periods on the EIR. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the consulting team at CH2M Hill and the legal team at Shute Mahali and Weinberger for the incredible hard work that they put into doing those written responses. I don't know I forget the exact number. It's somewhere in the 4 digits, I think.
Excuse me, I was instructed to say that there were way more than 4,000.
So,
should we ask who instructed? No.
And seeing the emails, timestamps that have come in, and days when they've come in, I think that between January and February, I'm not sure if any of the team working on this got a single weekend day off, and lots of timestamps at 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night. So they had been working tirelessly to get this done. So I didn't want to let it go unnoticed. Okay, I'm going to turn over to Dan. One more thing. So the final EIR, all these written comments will be incorporated into the final EIR, as we mentioned. That will be released and posted on the council's website. I think our target right now is somewhere between May 3rd and May 6th, so 10 to 13 days before your May 16th meeting. So the final EIR will be posted on the website then. So I'm going to turn over to Dan Ray to talk about the objectives of the Delta Plan and how the Delta Plan current draft and the alternatives do or do not satisfy those objectives.
Yeah, I don't know that if our council members need a reminder that the goals of the Delta Plan, the 2 co-equal goals, are to provide a reliable water supply for the state and protect, enhance, and restore the ecosystem of the Delta, to do it in a way that protects the Delta and the values of the Delta. the agricultural values and recreational values and cultural values of the Delta, its natural resources, but protect it in a way that recognizes it's an evolving place. It's a place that's going to change. There are 8 objectives that are inherent in those 2 co-equal goals that are spelled out in the Delta Plan, the Delta Reform Act, in terms of improving water management, encouraging water conservation, improving conveyance in the Delta, protecting or encouraging recreation, reducing threats and risks to public safety, and not unimportantly, creating a new form of governance, an effective form of governance in the Delta. The legislature directed that the plan be legally enforceable. It does that both in the findings that it adopted in the introduction of the Reform Act, as well as in its instructions, that the Delta plan be compatible with the National Coastal Zone Management Act, which requires enforceable provisions through a regulatory program. And the plan does that with 14 regulatory policies that are complemented by 71 non-binding recommendations to others. The new governance structure for the Delta is to oversee the implementation of the plan is created through the statutory coordination function, the Interagency Implementation Committee that you described in the Delta plan, the process for certifying that actions are consistent with the Delta plan so that we know that major activities are carrying out the broad direction the plan sets, and by providing the best available science to support Delta decisions through the development of the Delta Science Plan that you've been talking about with Peter over the last months, through the other activities of the Delta Science Program, and through the work of the Independent Science Board. And together, we think these policies and recommendations in the plan fulfill the legislature's direction to further the co-equal goals and their inherent objectives. The plan improves water supply reliability by requiring that the agencies that are using or exporting water or transferring through the Delta are doing what they're supposed to under state law to plan to improve the efficiency of their water use and develop alternative supplies that might be available from local resources. It also recommends, but can't require, that those who are using water elsewhere in the Delta watershed do likewise. It calls for timely completion of the studies that are underway of surface water storage for recovery of critically overdrafted groundwater basins that will help us better manage the surface water supplies conjunctively with the available groundwater. And it calls for timely and successful completion of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan to resolve conveyance issues in the Delta. It protects and restores the Delta ecosystem, in part also by calling on the State Water Resources Control Board to address one of the key stressors that's degrading the Delta, and that's the alteration of the flows that come into the estuary from the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers and their tributaries. It identifies 6 high-priority restoration areas in the Delta where it encourages restoration actions that would help restore habitats that can help recover species that are being affected by current Delta activities. And it includes a regulatory policy to protect those from activities that would prevent their restoration at some time in the future. It also recommends steps to reduce other stressors, including contaminants and predation, and also recommends expanding floodplains and riparian habitats along the tributaries that flow into the Delta. It protects and enhances the unique cultural and recreational values of the Delta by requiring that agencies in their land use, through their land use planning activities, locate development in urban areas so that rural lands are protected for agriculture. It requires consultation with local land use authorities when water or ecosystem restoration actions are planned so that we can avoid or reduce conflicts with with the land use activities that they've planned, and it asks those agencies to consider that they use the use of public sites before they acquire lands for those purposes from private property owners. It also recommends other activities that can strengthen the rural economy of the Delta and provide more recreation. The plan includes, as I said, actions to promote statewide water conservation, There's 12 recommendations to the State Water Resources Control Board and the Regional Water Quality Control Board to protect water quality. We've included a set of provisions that we think reduces risks by setting interim priorities for levee improvements while the council undertakes a more detailed program to identify long-term investment priorities for levee improvements. It has other standards for flood protection and recommends creation of a Delta Flood Risk Management District to strengthen emergency preparedness and collect funds from those who benefit from flood facilities to help pay for their maintenance and improvement. And it does establish, as I've said, the new governance structure we've talked about, including outlining an adaptive management process and the calls for the science plan to provide the best available science, and a process also for developing the finance plan to carry this all out. So we think that the plan that you've developed with the help of so much advice from our many stakeholders who participated does a good job of meeting those objectives. Now, what we did as part of this process to develop alternatives that in some ways reflect the various points of view of stakeholders who've been participating all along the way. We have, what the preferred project, revised project, the Delta plan itself, now before you. Another alternative is what we've called the proposed project, and that was the plan as it existed when the first draft of the EIR was released in November of 2011. That has many features in common with the plan that's before you today, but it's revised to better clarify how some aspects of the plan work. For example, the requirement for a science plan is new. Performance measures have been added to guide the monitoring of progress towards the goals. The policies of the recommendation to improve regional self-reliance throughout the Delta watershed was added, which we think comports more closely with the objectives of the Delta plan. A key difference in the Delta, the fifth draft, the proposed project, the alternative that was evaluated in the initial EIR, is that it hadn't been informed by the Delta Protections Commission Economic Sustainability Plan. And so the proposed project is a little weaker than the revised project, the final draft of the plan, in that it doesn't do as much to protect agricultural lands. It doesn't focus the restoration actions the plan proposes on those areas where they're most likely to succeed. It doesn't include as many activities to strengthen the Delta economy. So it's not quite as successful in meeting the Delta Reform Act's objectives and the project's objectives as the plan before you today. And then what the EIR laid out too was 3 or 4 other kinds of alternatives. And it's a way that's typically done in a planning activity. Often you have a project that emphasizes the kind of economic development side of a potential theme. You have an alternative that emphasizes the environmental protection element or theme to the alternative, and then maybe you have one that emphasizes local benefits for the project. And what's a nice approach, because it allows you to examine what would happen if you veered a little this way or that way as you try to balance the competing interests that have been before you. And I think what's been helpful as I reviewed for this meeting, to go back and examine those, because I think what it shows is those alternatives actually capture many of the points of view that are still being argued today. And as we go through these and then we think about the comments we received on the rulemaking package, you'll hear echoes of the 3 alternatives and the points of view of different stakeholders who've been commenting on the rules. The first alternative, 1A, is one that really favors economic development and by exporting more water out of the Delta. It has a decreased emphasis on local and regional water self-reliance. It focuses habitat restoration on the priority locations, but levee improvements are really only recommended to protect the high-priority water supply corridors rather than the broader approach of the standards that are incorporated in the Delta plan before you. It does not require that water suppliers that export water from or transfer water through or use water in the Delta verify that they're doing what they need to implement their ag or urban water management plans. It doesn't set a firm recommendation for the State Water Resources Control Board to update the flow standards to the Delta, as though we'd be delaying the return to a more natural hydrograph in the Delta that our scientists advise us is so important. It doesn't specify very clearly the actions that are needed to protect farmlands or the historic communities in the Delta. It limits states' investments in levee improvements to just locations where the property itself could repay would justify the improvements in the levees, and so there'd be a substantial reduction in investment in Delta levees and would leave more flood risk. Now, alternative 1B is much like that, but it would include absolutely no regulatory policies. The only actions that it would engender would be voluntary activities by state and local agencies, and there would be a large number of additional studies that would be called for before work would be undertaken. So it's much less effective in meeting the plan's objectives because it just relies on the goodwill of our partners. Alternative 2 is an emphasis that comes from the observations of many of the environmental groups that have participated in the Delta. It would recommend that, include a recommendation from you that the Water Board restrict the maximum amount of Delta water that could be used to 3 million acre-feet compared to the recent long-term average of 5 million acre-feet. You'll remember that that's about the same size that the folks we had here talking to you about the portfolio-based alternative at our last meeting were advocating as a size for the Delta diversion tunnels now under consideration. And it would require that irrigation water not be provided to drainage-impaired farmlands on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. It would substantially reduce the amount of water that's available. It would make our water supplies much less reliable, and it would eliminate farming on a fair amount of farmland in the San Joaquin Valley because while urban areas might have the ability to develop alternative local supplies through desalination or reclamation of wastewater, those sorts of supplies wouldn't be available for farmers because they'd be way too expensive and they're too far from it. Most of these farmlands are too far from sources of recycled water or from the ocean to benefit from those kinds of treatment technologies. So large acres of farmland would go out of production, and the environmental impacts of that in terms of loss of farm production and the impacts that go with that would be unacceptable. It would attempt to improve storage by adding about a 2.5 million acre-foot reservoir through, I would say it's a reapproximation of the Tulare Lake in the Tulare Lake basin, so that it would create a shallow reservoir that could receive runoff from those rivers that are tributary to the lake and be operated in conjunction with the Bryant Kern Canal and the canals on the west side of the valley to receive and store and then redistribute water through those systems. But that's a relatively modest contribution to the water supply. It would really have a yield of only about 300,000 acre-feet a year. So we'd end up with substantial increases in groundwater pumping under this alternative. And generally just doesn't get us where we need to go on the water supply reliability side. The third alternative we considered was really one that was developed to reflect views that were being expressed by in-Delta stakeholders. So it would include the restrictions that are in the current plan or variations thereof that would apply to people who use water outside the Delta, but not those who use it within the Delta. So again, we would get some improvements in water management, but not as many as we would get and not as effective as we would get from the plan as proposed, which affects all water users who are moving water in or using it in the Delta. And it focuses the habitat restoration actions on public land. Again, there's not so much of that that's available. Most public land in the Delta is subsided deeply, so it's not suitable for restoration, so we'd get a much smaller output from the restoration side, impair our ability to create the large, better connected patches of habitat that the scientists tell us we need. It also would, because it reflects the local points of view about flexibility in using lands, even those within the floodplains, it would not prevent encroachment on floodplains along the lower San Joaquin River And so that would put more folks at risk and would also prevent us from achieving some of the other benefits of being able to reflood that area in terms of the ecosystem benefits. So what's been interesting to me as I've gone back through this is to see that the evaluation of these alternatives and trying to understand how they help meet the Delta Plan's objectives hasn't been just an academic exercise or something that helps satisfy the law, but actually informs our decision, because we've been able to examine, well, how effective would the plan be if it moved in these different directions, and see that you've been able to arrive at a plan that balances the many points of view that you've heard by stakeholders who have been advocating the very positions that are outlined in these alternatives. And it also, as Jim will explain, that the other alternatives also have environmental impacts that are make them less advantageous than the plan is proposed.
And the terrific summary that Dan just gave is in more detail in attachments 1 and 2 to the memo 6A that's in your board packet. So if you want to know more about that, what Dan just gave, that's where that's contained. So back to the EIR issues, and as Dan just mentioned, the things that we learned from the EIR and the EIR process to date. One of them, as Dan mentioned, was that the final staff draft Delta plan is environmentally superior to the other alternatives, for some of the same reasons that Dan mentioned, but it's viewed through a slightly different lens. And I'll cover them briefly because Dan just gave a pretty good summary. The final staff draft is superior to the fifth staff draft for some of the reasons Dan said. Has stronger measures for Delta water quality, so it helps sort of arrest the declining water quality crisis in the Delta, and it also encourages watershed users of water in the Delta watershed to develop local water supplies to help stem that decline of water supply reliability. Alternatives 1A and 1B, as Dan mentioned, they do less to stem the decline of the Delta ecosystem. They have fewer ecosystem restoration projects, less emphasis on natural flows, which is, we've concluded, are necessary for the ecosystem. Alternative 2, which is the one that comes from the environmental, informed by the environmental community, as Dan mentioned, it's less to arrest the water supply reliability problem because of the 3 million acre feet cap. Also would convert or leave unused 700,000 acres of farmland. About half of that comes from the Tulare Lake Basin, which is used for farmland now. It is better for the ecosystem, the environmental alternative. Alternative 2. And then Alternative 3, the sort of Delta-focused one, as Dan mentioned, it does less to stem the declining ecosystem, more to preserve agricultural land, but there's a lot of drainage problems that come with the agricultural land in the Delta. So for those reasons, the EIR concludes that the final staff draft is the environmentally superior alternative.
Mr. Chair? Just on that point, James, because I noted that in the summary. So would you want to expand upon it a little bit? Because, again, you just did a brief summary of that, but you just said a lot of problems come with agricultural land in the Delta. So clarify what you mean by that, please. I know it's in the document, but that's...
I'm not sure if that's the word I use. It may have been in misspoke. There are drainage problems, I said, that come with agricultural land in the Delta. And the way CEQA works, and the EIR does say that Alternatives 2 and Alternatives 3 are slightly environmentally inferior. It is, this is a degree of gradation, but CEQA protects both agricultural land and, it protects a number of resources, Appendix G, the checklist, to the CEQA guidelines. I forget how many numbers there are, but it's somewhere 13, 14, 15 different resource areas. Agricultural land being one. We got some comments from some commenters coming from sort of the environmental stakeholder side that said, well, how is it possible that the alternative that we submitted is not the environmentally superior one? And as I mentioned, it is superior from respect to the environment if you consider the environment to be only sort of Delta ecosystem environment. But because CEQA defines environment to include agricultural land as a protected resource, and because of the significant acreage that would be lost to agricultural land through Alternative 2, and some other issues, the EIR concluded that that loss of agricultural land renders alternative 2 slightly environmentally inferior because of the protection CEQA has for agricultural land. Alternative 3, because it does less to stem the declining ecosystem, because of some of the issues Dan mentioned about patchwork and some other issues, and because although it does protect agricultural land better, on balance between the ecosystem restoration not doing as much, and although it does protect more agriculture, that's not a pure good in terms of the agricultural issue because of a bit of the drainage. But it's a balancing act, and the EIR is very clear that alternative 3 is slightly environmentally inferior.
Appreciate the clarification. Thank you.
So the other things we learned from the Delta plan, from the EIR, and we've mentioned this before, and this is that the long-term benefits of the Delta plan are not free. They're going to come at short-term cost from construction, doing new levees, reinforcing levees, doing construction work to do habitat restoration projects, building new water supply reliability projects, new reservoirs, new water treatment plants. Anytime you do construction, that can have environmental impacts. So I think it's, as I mentioned at the outset of this, the informed decision-making, eyes wide open, doing what the Delta Reform Act calls for and solving the crisis problem, or at least moving in that direction, isn't free. There will be some environmental consequences, at least in the short term. But importantly, the mitigation measures that the EIR sets forth will generally help reduce those short-term costs. And these mitigation measures are generally standard type best management practices that are employed through the construction process. Not all of them are construction related, but most of them are. And those mitigation measures have been in the EIR since 2011, since the first EIR went out. They modified slightly in the November 2012 one. And this is really the main value that the EIR has provided to the Delta Plan process and generally does provide, is that the Delta Plan is actually being modified through incorporation of the mitigation measures. So the mitigation measures that are listed in the EIR are required through policy GP1. So we could have actually taken all the mitigation measures, and you have them, there's 70 pages of them, and added them actually into the Delta Plan, but that would have been cumbersome. So we've effectively done that through incorporation by reference through General Plan, GP1, Governance Policy 1. So the Delta Plan actually has been modified and improved to lessen impacts on the environment through incorporation of the EIR's mitigation measures.
And this is the way GP1 works is that, remember that if you've got an action that's covered by the plan, you have to, if the mitigation measures are applicable to your situation, and many times they won't be, of course, because you're not doing a project to which they relate, but if they do apply and they are feasible, again, the local agency or the approving agency can look at a mitigation measure and go, gee, this won't work for us because it's too expensive, or technically it won't work in this situation, or socially unacceptable. But if it is feasible, then they need to either adopt that or equivalent measure. It could be that people say, gee, in our county, we do it this way, not that way, but we think it works just as well. So these are broad guidelines that people can examine their own activities against. With the relatively standard practices, we've tried to revise them to reflect advice we've gotten along the way, and you'll see the mitigation measures that are there for your information reflect some revisions that we've made on the advice of folks who've commented on the plan and with the professional expertise of our consultants.
So the three things Dan just mentioned are that the measures are required if they're factually applicable, if they're feasible, and there's the opportunity for substitute mitigation. So that's flexibility that's built into the actual language of GP1. So I think that's the right balance to allow locals at that project EIR level to do more refined thinking on that. So I'm going to turn over to Ellen to talk about, summarize some of the major comment themes that we got, the more common themes on the comments we got on the EIR, and talk about those.